I didn't invite my fiancé to the family trip he helped finance because my mother invited my ex. I wasn't the one to blame, but he blocked his cards and now left us without money in another country. He is inconsiderate. When you have been engaged to someone for 8 months, you expect a certain level of emotional maturity and unconditional support, which is exactly why I thought Julian, my fiancé, was different. He holds a highly lucrative corporate position that allows him to live very comfortably, so when my family started planning our dream vacation to a boutique resort in Italy, he generously offered to cover 70% of the total cost. It was a beautiful gesture, and I made sure to show him how much I appreciated it, believing that our partnership was built on a foundation of mutual happiness. He always claimed he wanted nothing more than to see me smile and to integrate himself into my family's lives. This trip was supposed to be the ultimate celebration of our upcoming marriage and a way for my relatives to truly bond with him in a luxurious setting. Everything was meticulously arranged, from the private tours of the Tuscan vineyards to the dining reservations at Michelin-starred restaurants overlooking the coast. My mother and my siblings had been talking about this getaway for months, and Julian seemed more than happy to step up as the benevolent provider who could make their dreams come true. I spent weeks coordinating dates, managing flights, and ensuring that every single detail aligned perfectly so that there would be absolutely no stress for anyone involved. Julian's career demands a massive amount of his time, but he assured me that nothing would keep him from joining us on this unforgettable European escape. I felt incredibly secure in our relationship, confident that we were entirely on the same page regarding family values and shared responsibilities. Then, exactly 1 week before our scheduled departure, my mother threw a massive wrench into our pristine plans by informing me that she had extended an invitation to Scott, my ex-boyfriend. She explained that Scott was going through an incredibly rough patch in his personal life and desperately needed a distraction, and since she has always viewed him like a son, she couldn't bear to leave him behind. I was immediately put in a highly difficult position through absolutely no fault of my own, caught between my mother's boundless compassion and the reality of my current relationship. It was completely unfair of her to ambush me with this decision so late in the game, but she had already purchased his ticket and finalized his inclusion in the family circle. I knew right away that this sudden addition would create an incredibly awkward atmosphere if Julian were to find out. Instead of panicking or causing an unnecessary scene with my mother, I decided to handle the situation with the utmost logic and maturity to preserve everyone's peace of mind. I knew that Julian, despite his professional success, can be deeply insecure and sensitive about my past, and having Scott around would only trigger his defensive mechanisms. It became clear to me that the most elegant solution to avoid any uncomfortable confrontations or emotional drama during the vacation was to alter the guest list slightly. I realized that since Julian had several massive corporate projects reaching their critical phases at work, it would actually be a blessing in disguise for him to stay behind. I convinced myself that by shielding him from this awkward family dynamic, I was actually performing a profound act of emotional labor to protect his focus and well-being. When I sat Julian down to explain that it would be best for him to skip this specific trip to concentrate on his career milestones, I expected him to understand the deeper intention behind my words. Instead, his entire demeanor shifted, and he chose to interpret my protective gesture as a personal rejection, focusing entirely on the fact that he was being left out. I explained to him calmly and repeatedly that I wasn't the one to blame for the situation, as my mother was the sole mastermind behind Scott's invitation. Julian completely refused to look at the bigger picture, stubbornly clinging to his hurt pride rather than validating the massive effort I was making to prevent a catastrophic clash of egos in Italy. He couldn't seem to grasp that my loyalty to him remained untouched, and that I was simply managing a chaotic family variable the best way I knew how. Since the financial arrangements for the boutique resort had already been set in motion weeks prior, I naturally kept the supplementary credit card Julian had given me for our shared expenses in my wallet. In my mind, his financial commitment to my happiness and my family's well-being was an independent promise that shouldn't be revoked just because of a minor logistical adjustment. He had explicitly dedicated those funds to this vacation, and it would be incredibly petty to assume he would want us to suffer or face financial strain abroad over a decision he didn't agree with. I viewed the card as a secure safety net, an extension of his love that would ensure our trip proceeded smoothly despite his physical absence. It was the only logical assumption to make, given how deeply he claimed to care about my family's comfort and joy. The flight to Italy was filled with anticipation, and when my family and I finally arrived at the stunning boutique resort, the scenery was absolutely breathtaking. My mother was ecstatic, my siblings were amazed by the luxury, and even Scott seemed genuinely grateful to be included in such a rejuvenating environment. I felt a profound sense of pride knowing that I had managed to orchestrate this entire escape while successfully avoiding the explosive drama that Julian's presence surely would have caused. We walked into the grand lobby, surrounded by marble floors and elegant decor, ready to check into our premium suites and begin the vacation of a lifetime. I approached the polished wooden front desk with absolute confidence, eager to finalize the check-in process and get everyone settled into their rooms. I handed my identification and Julian's supplementary credit card to the receptionist, expecting the usual seamless transaction that accompanies high-end establishments. The young woman behind the counter smiled warmly, keyed in our reservation details, and slid the plastic card through the sleek electronic terminal to secure the room deposit and incidental expenses. Suddenly, a sharp, jarring beep echoed through the quiet lobby, instantly shattering the serene atmosphere I had worked so hard to maintain. I watched in sudden disbelief as the receptionist's smile faltered slightly, her eyes scanning the small digital display before she looked up at me with an expression of professional concern. The terminal let out 3 harsh, consecutive error beeps as the screen flashed the words, "Transaction declined," in bright, unforgiving lettering. A wave of intense heat rushed to my face, but I maintained my composure, assuming it was merely a temporary network glitch or a regional security lock that needed to be bypassed. I calmly instructed the receptionist to try swiping the card 2 more times, insisting that there must be an error on the bank's end because the account possessed an exceptionally high limit. The machine repeated those exact same 3 mocking, repetitive beeps, cementing the absolute humiliation of hearing that public rejection sound in front of my entire family and my ex-boyfriend. Scott stood just a few feet away, watching the entire exchange unfold, which made the stinging sting of the situation entirely unbearable for me to endure. It was completely obvious that Julian had intentionally sabotaged our arrival, using his financial power to inflict the maximum amount of public embarrassment upon me. The reality of what my fiancé had done settled heavily in my stomach as the receptionist politely explained that the card had been completely blocked by the primary account holder. Julian had deliberately cut off our access to the funds, leaving my family and me entirely stranded at the front desk of a foreign luxury hotel without a single care for our safety. His reaction was so incredibly excessive, unfair, and ungrateful, especially considering that I had uninvited him solely to spare his feelings from the awkwardness of Scott's presence. To punish an entire family and leave his own fiancé completely penniless in another country because of a situation caused entirely by my mother is the epitome of toxic control. He proved himself to be utterly inconsiderate, transforming what should have been a peaceful resolution into an emotionally chaotic nightmare fueled entirely by his petty vengeance. Main story comments. Anonymous user 1 says, "You literally uninvited the person paying for the trip so you could vacation with your ex. What did you expect?" OP's reply, "I did it to avoid a confrontation. My mother invited Scott, not me. Julian should be mature enough to support my family regardless." Anonymous user 2 says, "That card belongs to him, he has every right to cut off funding for a trip he was excluded from." OP's reply, "The card was given to me as his fiancé. Revoking it in a foreign country is dangerous and financially abusive." Update 1. It's been 12 hours since my last update, and I am still reeling from the absolute chaos that Julian's childish financial tantrum has inflicted upon my family. After being humiliated at the front desk, I spent the last several hours text bombarding his phone, demanding an immediate explanation for this malicious behavior. I sent dozens of messages outlining exactly why his actions were completely unacceptable and dangerous given our current geographical location. He remained completely silent for what felt like an eternity, leaving me to pace around the elegant hotel lobby while trying to maintain some semblance of dignity. When his notification finally flashed on my screen, I expected an apology or at least a rational explanation for the system error. Instead, he replied with a cold, completely detached message that felt like a slap in the face after 8 months of total devotion. He stated with absolute finality that since he was no longer a registered guest on this vacation, he had officially cancelled all of his financial liability for the entire trip. This included not only revoking my access to his supplementary credit funds, but also completely canceling the luxury hotel reservation he had previously secured. I was absolutely paralyzed by the sheer coldness of his text, unable to comprehend how someone who claims to love me could execute such a ruthless maneuver. He completely unraveled months of meticulous planning with a single press of a button, entirely disregarding the well-being of the woman he intends to marry. I immediately attempted to call him to make him understand the flaw in his twisted reasoning, but he continuously redirected my calls straight to voicemail. I then sent another massive wave of messages, breaking down the situation with simple, irrefutable logic so he could see he was punishing the absolute wrong person. I explicitly reiterated that I did not choose to invite Scott, nor did I have any hand in his sudden appearance on this getaway. The entire decision was orchestrated solely by my mother, who acted independently out of her own sense of charity toward my struggling ex-boyfriend. Julian was completely blind to this distinction, choosing to hold me personally accountable for an action that was entirely outside of my control. No matter how clearly I laid out the facts, Julian completely refused to listen to reason or validate the impossible position I had been placed in. He sent one final, stinging reply telling me to go ahead and enjoy my trip with what he sarcastically labeled as my irreal family. The sheer malice in his tone was deeply offensive, shifting the entire focus away from my mother's blunder and turning it into a twisted critique of my loyalty. He wanted to play the victim so badly that he completely ignored how hard I had worked to shield his fragile ego from discomfort. It became painfully obvious that he was using this entire scenario as a pathetic excuse to assert dominance and control over my life through financial deprivation. Because of his profound pettiness, the boutique hotel staff informed us that our luxury suites were no longer available since the primary payment method had been revoked. We were forced to immediately downgrade our entire accommodation plan to whatever options were left available at the absolute last minute. The only remaining spaces in the entire establishment were two cramped, terrible standard rooms located directly adjacent to the incredibly noisy maintenance area. My family had to scramble to gather their luggage and move into these depressing quarters, a stark and horrifying contrast to the luxury we had been promised. The constant humming of the hotel generators and the clanging of tools became the agonizing soundtrack to our supposed dream vacation. This humiliating downgrade was only possible because my mother managed to scrape together enough funds on her personal credit card to cover these basic rooms. She had to max out her own limit just to keep us from being tossed out onto the Italian streets in the middle of the night. I felt a deep sense of shame watching her hand over her card, knowing that my fiancé should have been the one protecting her from this financial strain. Julian's complete abandonment left her vulnerable, forcing her to sacrifice her own financial comfort to rectify a crisis he entirely manufactured out of spite. It was a completely unnecessary burden placed on a woman who was simply trying to do a good deed for a family friend. Naturally, my family is now absolutely furious at Julian's complete and total lack of chivalry throughout this entire ordeal. My siblings cannot comprehend how a man with his extensive resources could leave his future in-laws stranded in a foreign country over a minor disagreement. They keep talking about how a real gentleman would have sucked up his pride and sorted out the financial details before dealing with any interpersonal conflict. My mother is deeply hurt that the man she welcomed into her life would treat her with such blatant disrespect and cold indifference. The entire atmosphere of the trip has been thoroughly poisoned, and his name is now synonymous with betrayal within our family circle. Throughout this exhausting night, Scott became the only source of genuine comfort and emotional support available to me while Julian ignored my existence. He sat with me in one of those cramped, noisy standard rooms, patiently listening to me cry for hours as the weight of the situation crashed down on me. Scott was deeply apologetic, feeling immense guilt for inadvertently causing this rift despite only being a passive guest invited by my mother. His empathy stood in sharp, undeniable contrast to Julian's complete lack of emotional intelligence and refusal to answer a single one of my desperate phone calls. It was truly pathetic that my ex-boyfriend showed more concern for my mental state than the man who placed a diamond ring on my finger. I stayed up until dawn, staring at my phone and hoping that Julian would finally snap out of his delusional state and realize the gravity of his actions. Every single time I tried to dial his number, the call was abruptly cut off, proving that he was actively rejecting my attempts to restore sanity to this situation. He chose to hide behind his silenced phone like a coward, leaving me to drown in the emotional fallout of his calculated financial abuse. I could not sleep due to the combination of the roaring maintenance machines outside and the overwhelming anger boiling inside my chest. I kept replaying his cold messages, amazed at how a grown man could justify ruining an entire vacation just because he didn't get his way. By the time the sun rose over the resort, I realized that Julian's stubbornness had reached a level of toxicity that I could no longer minimize or excuse. He deliberately transformed a minor misunderstanding about a family guest list into a full-scale emotional warfare campaign against his own fiancé. I refused to accept any blame for this disaster, as my intentions were completely pure and focused entirely on maintaining the peace. Julian's decision to weaponize his wealth to punish my family is something I will never forget or easily forgive. He has shown his true colors as an incredibly inconsiderate and fragile individual who values his own pride far above the safety and happiness of the woman he claims to love. Update 1 comments. Anonymous user 1 says, "You still don't get it. You chose your mother and your ex over your fiancé." OP's reply, "I chose peace. If Julian truly loved me, he wouldn't let a minor seating arrangement ruin his financial support for my family." Anonymous user 2 says, Julian saved himself from a lifetime of being taken advantage of. OP's reply, Julian is acting like a spoiled brat who takes his toys away when he doesn't get his way. Update 2. It's been 3 days since my last update, and the situation has deteriorated from an uncomfortable ordeal into an absolute, unmitigated nightmare that is entirely Julian's fault. Our time in Italy has been completely ruined by his initial financial blockade, forcing us to spend our days trapped in those horrific maintenance-adjacent rooms. I have been trying my absolute best to maintain a positive attitude for the sake of my family, but the emotional strain is becoming impossible to manage. Julian continues to maintain his childish wall of silence, ignoring every single email and message I send attempting to resolve this ridiculous conflict. His complete refusal to engage in a mature dialogue has left us utterly abandoned in a foreign land. Determined to salvage what was left of this vacation and prove to ourselves that we didn't need Julian's toxic, controlling energy to have a good time, I decided we needed a distraction. Scott had mentioned how much he really wanted to experience an exclusive boat excursion along the beautiful Italian coastline, which sounded like the perfect way to lift everyone's spirits. I felt that as a good hostess, it was my duty to make sure our guests still had a memorable experience despite my fiancé's active sabotage. My family deserved to experience at least one moment of luxury after being forced into subpar living conditions for days. I convinced my mother that we should splurge on this boat trip as a definitive statement of our independence from Julian's financial chains. We approached the local excursion office with renewed hope, ready to leave the dark cloud of Julian's pettiness behind us for at least an afternoon. Since Julian's cards were still completely blocked, I attempted to use my mother's personal debit card to finalize the booking for the private boat. I handed the card over to the tour operator, praying that this transaction would proceed without the humiliating drama we experienced at the resort desk. The agent processed the payment, but instead of a confirmation ticket, he gave us a look of profound apology that instantly triggered my anxiety. He informed us that the transaction had been abruptly denied, throwing our plans into immediate and absolute disarray once again. Because we are currently traveling abroad, my mother's bank automatically flagged the large international transaction as highly suspicious and fraudulent. Instead of just declining the specific charge, the automated security system went completely nuclear and froze her entire banking account. This meant that she could no longer access any of her savings, use her cards for basic meals, or withdraw a single euro from the local ATMs. We went from being budget-constrained to being completely, utterly penniless in a foreign country where we barely speak the native language. It was a terrifying realization that left my mother in tears and my siblings in a state of absolute panic right there on the dock. This financial catastrophe would never have occurred if Julian hadn't forced us into this desperate financial corner to begin with. If he had maintained his original commitment like a mature adult, my mother would never have had to risk using her primary debit card for an emergency excursion. I refused to let anyone blame my plan, because my only goal was to bring a shred of joy to an otherwise ruined family vacation. The blame lies squarely on Julian's shoulders for initiating the domino effect that led to our complete financial paralysis. His initial act of malice forced us into a survival mode that ultimately broke my mother's fragile financial safety net. Out of sheer desperation and possessing absolutely no other options, I decided to take matters into my own hands and contact Julian's parents. I assumed that as mature adults who have known me for months, they would have the basic decency and common sense to talk some serious sense into their son. I firmly believed that once they heard how their future daughter-in-law was stranded abroad without money, they would be horrified by Julian's ungentlemanly behavior. My plan was for them to intervene immediately, order him to unblock the supplementary card, or at least force him to wire us some emergency funds to ensure our safety. I expected a rational, family-oriented response from people who were supposed to become my legal in-laws in a matter of months. I dialed his mother's number, my voice trembling with the immense stress of the past 3 days as I prepared to explain our dire situation. The moment she answered, I laid out the entire narrative, focusing heavily on how Julian's extreme overreaction had left an entire family completely penniless in Italy. I made sure to emphasize the terrible tone Julian had used and how his financial abuse was actively endangering our physical well-being. I expected her to gasp in horror at her son's cruelty and immediately offer a solution to protect our family's dignity. Instead, the silence on the other end of the line was incredibly cold and foreboding before she finally spoke. To my absolute horror and amazement, Julian's mother didn't offer a single word of sympathy or a shred of maternal understanding. Instead, she unleashed a wave of verbal hostility, calling me completely delusional and utterly shameless for even making the phone call. She told me that I had an unbelievable amount of nerve to exclude her son from a trip he funded and then beg his family for money. She explicitly stated that I was entirely responsible for my own choices and that I should look to my ex-boyfriend for financial assistance since I valued his presence so much. She concluded her toxic tirade by telling me never to contact their family ever again before slamming the phone down in my ear. I stood in the middle of the resort lobby, completely stunned by how deeply ingrained this profound lack of empathy runs within Julian's entire household. It is completely terrifying to realize that his mother is just as cold, stubborn, and uncompromising as he has proven himself to be over the last few days. She completely twisted the facts to make me look like the villain, totally ignoring that my mother was the one who invited Scott. They are actively enabling Julian's controlling behavior, validating his right to abandon his fiancé in a foreign country over a minor interpersonal misunderstanding. This entire family lacks the basic moral framework required to understand unconditional love and familial obligation. Now, we are trapped in this beautiful country with absolutely zero access to money, living off the bare minimum while trying to figure out how we will even survive the remaining days. My family is completely exhausted, Scott is incredibly uncomfortable with the escalating family drama, and I am consumed by an overwhelming sense of injustice. Julian has successfully used his wealth and his family's toxic support to isolate and punish me for a situation I didn't create. It is incredibly unfair that my entire life is being upended simply because I made a mature decision to keep the peace. I will never forgive Julian or his mother for leaving us completely helpless and stranded while they sit comfortably in their self-righteous delusions. Update 2 comments. Anonymous user 1 says, "You tried to buy your ex a boat trip with frozen funds while your fiancé sits at home?" Iconic. OP's reply, "Scott is a guest and my mother's friend. I was trying to be a good hostess since Julian ruined the original itinerary." Anonymous user 2 says, "His parents gave you the exact reality check you desperately needed." OP's reply, "They are enabling his controlling behavior. A real man protects his fiancé, he doesn't leave her stranded." Update 3. It's been 1 week since my last update, and we have finally managed to return home after experiencing the most stressful and humiliating journey of my entire life. The final days in Italy were an absolute nightmare of financial desperation and logistical chaos. My mother was forced to swallow her pride and beg a distant relative for a high-interest emergency loan just to settle our remaining hotel balance so we wouldn't be detained. The sheer embarrassment of having to expose our private family struggles to extended relatives was entirely Julian's doing. We arrived back in our home city completely exhausted, emotionally drained, and deeply traumatized by the entire ordeal. I took a taxi straight to the apartment I shared with Julian, fully expecting to confront him face to face and demand a massive apology for his reckless behavior abroad. The moment I unlocked the front door and stepped inside, an eerie, hollow silence washed over me that instantly filled me with dread. I walked through the entryway and realized with a sickening shock that the space looked entirely different and shockingly barren. Julian had completely moved out every single one of his belongings while I was away, stripping the apartment of his presence entirely. The living room furniture was reconfigured, his bookshelves were empty, and the home we were building together had been thoroughly dismantled. I walked into the kitchen, my heart pounding with a mixture of intense rage and disbelief as I surveyed the empty counters. There, sitting right next to the coffee maker, was a spare set of keys left carelessly on the surface. Next to the keys lay a brief, printed note that he had sent from his personal email address, formalizing his cowardice in writing. The note stated with absolute coldness that the wedding was officially called off, our relationship was completely over, and he expected the engagement ring back by the end of the week. I stared at the paper, absolutely outraged by the sheer audacity and lack of respect demonstrated in those brief, heartless sentences. To end an 8-month engagement and dismantle a shared life over a simple family vacation disagreement is the ultimate sign of emotional immaturity. I am absolutely refusing to return the engagement ring to him, regardless of whatever arbitrary deadline he sets in his pathetic notes. Legally and morally, that ring was given to me as a permanent gift, a symbol of a commitment that he was the one to abruptly break. Furthermore, I firmly believe that he owes me that diamond as a form of well-deserved compensation for the immense psychological distress he caused us. The humiliation he inflicted upon my family in a foreign country deserves some form of financial accountability, and keeping the ring is the only fair resolution. Unfortunately, the drama didn't stop at the threshold of my empty apartment, as things are quickly getting incredibly ugly within my own household now. Instead of remaining united against the man who abandoned us, my mother and my siblings have suddenly started to snap at me constantly. They are experiencing massive financial stress due to the high-interest loan my mother had to secure to get us out of Italy. In a twisted turn of events, they are now claiming that I should have managed Julian better to prevent him from blocking the credit cards. They are completely rewriting history, choosing to blame my communication skills rather than addressing Julian's inherent cruelty and vindictiveness. It is deeply frustrating to listen to my own flesh and blood turn on me when I was the one protecting them from Julian's fragile ego the entire time. They seem to have completely forgotten that it was my mother's initial decision to invite Scott that triggered this entire chain of events. Now that the financial reality of their choices is setting in, they are looking for an easy scapegoat to relieve their own guilt. They are projecting their anger about the debt onto me, acting as if I have some magical remote control over my ex-fiancé's banking accounts. This sudden lack of solidarity from my own family is a heartbreaking betrayal that I never anticipated experiencing. To make matters even more insulting, Scott has completely stopped replying to any of my text messages or phone calls over the last 48 hours. The radio silence began the exact moment I sent him a polite message asking if he could chip in a small amount toward paying off the emergency loan. Given that he was the one who enjoyed the resort and directly benefited from my mother's financial sacrifice, it is only fair that he contributes to the debt. He claimed to be so incredibly grateful and supportive while we were crying in Italy, yet the moment money is mentioned, he completely vanishes into thin air. His sudden disappearance proves that his supposed empathy was entirely hollow, leaving my family to carry the financial burden alone. I am currently sitting in a half-empty apartment, surrounded by boxes, trying to comprehend how my entire reality shifted so drastically in just 1 week. I have lost my partner, my future wedding, and my financial stability all because I tried to handle a complicated family dynamic with maturity. Julian's extreme actions have caused a massive rift that is tearing my family apart from the inside out as the debt continues to loom over us. I refuse to let him win this psychological warfare, which is exactly why I am holding on to the engagement ring with an iron grip. It represents the only leverage I have left against a man who systematically destroyed my happiness out of pure, unadulterated spite. My sister had the nerve to call me earlier today just to scream at me about the upcoming monthly payment due to our relative. She claimed that my stubbornness has put our mother's financial future in jeopardy, completely ignoring the fact that I didn't freeze the bank accounts. I tried to explain to her, using clear logic, that Julian is the sole villain in this narrative, but she completely refused to listen to my side. The stress is causing everyone to lose their minds, turning our home into a toxic war zone of constant screaming matches and bitter accusations. It is deeply unfair that I am being forced to bear the emotional brunt of a crisis manufactured entirely by 2 grown men. I am still completely convinced that once the initial panic over the high-interest loan subsides, my family will finally remember who the real enemy is here. Julian is the one who chose to weaponize his wealth, cancel the reservations, and leave us completely stranded without a care in the world. No matter how much my siblings snap at me right now, the objective truth remains entirely unchanged. I acted with the best intentions to preserve peace, and I will not let their financial anxiety force me into admitting a guilt that isn't mine. I will continue to stand my ground against Julian's lawyers and my family's displaced anger because I know I am completely blameless. Update 3 comments. Anonymous user 1 says, legally and morally, you have to return the ring if the wedding is off. OP's reply, he broke the contract by abandoning me in Europe. The ring stays with me as collateral for the hotel debt he caused. Anonymous user 2 says, even your enabling family is realizing your stubbornness ruined everything. OP's reply, they are just stressed about the money. Once they calm down, they will remember Julian is the one who blocked the cards. Update 4. It's been 3 weeks since my last update, and the total ostracism of my entire existence within my own social and familial circle is now completely absolute. The fallout from the Italy trip has permanently fractured my relationships, leaving me completely isolated in a way I never thought possible. My mother and my siblings have completely stopped inviting me to our traditional Sunday family dinners, acting as if I no longer exist. I find out about these gatherings through mutual relatives, which adds an extra layer of bitter sting to my daily life. They have effectively banished me from the family unit, punishing me for a crisis that they heavily contributed to creating. My sister went so far as to openly confront me textually, stating explicitly that I have completely ruined the family's financial stability solely due to my immense pride. She delivered this cruel monologue without a single shred of empathy, focusing entirely on the burden of the high-interest loan they are now struggling to repay. She chose to completely blame me for losing a wealthy fiancé who used to generously pay for our expensive dinners and lavish family trips. It is disgusting how quickly their affection vanished the moment the financial perks associated with Julian were completely disconnected from our lives. They are mourning the loss of his bank account, not the loss of a genuine relationship or my personal happiness. Throughout all of their bitter accusations and screaming matches, they are completely and conveniently ignoring the most crucial fact of the entire narrative. They refused to acknowledge that it was my mother who independently chose to invite Scott to a vacation he had absolutely no business attending. If she hadn't extended that initial invitation out of her misplaced sense of charity, Julian would have never had an excuse to throw his financial tantrum. I am being made to carry the entire weight of her terrible decision, transformed into the family scapegoat simply because I tried to manage the situation maturely. Their complete lack of accountability is mind-blowing, proving that they would rather blame me than face their own massive blunders. To add a final, pathetic layer of insult to this entire tragedy, Scott has now completely blocked me across every single social media platform. I discovered this when I attempted to check on his profile to see if he had finally found employment to help us with the loan payments. He didn't even have the decency to send an explanatory message before severing our digital connection entirely. A mutual acquaintance informed me that Scott explicitly stated he wants absolutely no drama regarding my family's mounting financial debts and interpersonal issues. He used my family for a free vacation to Europe, watched us drown in financial ruin, and then discarded me the moment he was asked to show some basic accountability. The legal pressure regarding my remaining assets also escalated dramatically when a courier arrived at my door early last week. Julian's high-priced corporate lawyer sent a formal, incredibly aggressive demand letter insisting upon the immediate return of the engagement ring. The document was filled with intimidating legal jargon, threatening severe lawsuits and public court battles if I failed to comply with their strict deadline. I spent hours consulting with free legal aid, hoping to find a loophole that would allow me to keep the diamond as collateral for our distress. Ultimately, I realized that I had to give it back simply to avoid getting completely dragged into an expensive legal battle I couldn't afford. Handing that ring over to the courier was one of the most bitter moments of my life, as it felt like surrendering to Julian's financial tyranny. The diamond that once represented a promise of a beautiful future was weaponized against me until the very end to ensure my total compliance. Julian used his immense resources to strip away my last remaining piece of financial leverage, leaving me completely empty-handed. He sat comfortably in his luxury office while his legal attack dogs forced me into submission, proving once again how incredibly ruthless he truly is. There was no closure, no maturity, just a cold transactional exchange that left me feeling thoroughly violated. Now, the reality of my absolute isolation has fully set in, and I am forced to navigate a completely empty life entirely on my own. I have officially lost my fiancé, my gorgeous luxury apartment, my dream wedding, and now my own family refuses to speak a single word to me. I am living in a tiny, depressing rental space that I can barely afford, a far cry from the life of comfort I spent months building. My phone remains completely silent throughout the day, devoid of the checking-in texts that used to fill my screen before this disaster occurred. The absolute silence in my living space is a constant, agonizing reminder of how quickly everything can be systematically dismantled. I spend my evenings pacing around my small room, replaying every single decision I made leading up to that fateful arrival at the Italian resort desk. No matter how many times I analyze the sequence of events, my logical conclusion remains completely and entirely unshaken. I know with absolute certainty that every single action I took was motivated by a desire to preserve peace and protect people's feelings from unnecessary conflict. I was the only person acting with true maturity, attempting to navigate an impossible situation thrust upon me by my mother's lack of boundaries. The fact that my life has been completely ruined because of my selflessness is a profound tragedy of the highest order. It is deeply, fundamentally unfair how a woman can lose her entire life and identity just because a man decided to be incredibly inconsiderate over a simple family trip. Julian had the financial power to handle the situation with grace, to show true chivalry, and to support his future wife regardless of family dynamics. Instead, he chose the path of maximum destruction, using his wealth as a hammer to crush my happiness and alienate me from my relatives. He allowed his fragile ego to dictate the fate of our engagement, proving that his love was entirely conditional upon total compliance and control. He is the sole architect of this widespread misery, yet he gets to walk away completely unscathed while I pick up the shattered pieces. Even though I am completely alone and surrounded by the ruins of my former life, I refuse to let their collective gaslighting break my spirit. I will continue to hold my head high, secure in the absolute knowledge that I am the true victim of this emotionally chaotic saga. Julian's pettiness, my mother's complete lack of boundaries, Scott's profound ingratitude, and my family's displaced financial anxiety are the real culprits here. They can keep me excluded from their dinners and their lives, but they can never force me to admit to a guilt that belongs entirely to them. I will survive this injustice, forever vindicated by the objective truth that I did absolutely nothing wrong.